Selfishness is a swamp that sucks in all and gives nothing back. John Thornton. Victim or cold-blooded murderer? It seems to be the argument made in many killer-parent cases. Defense lawyers often try to victimize their clients as a way to make them seem as innocent as possible and to remove culpability for their crimes. But how much past trauma can be used as an excuse when a mother kills her children? On September 26, 1971, Linda and Harry Vaughn welcomed their daughter into the world. Though Linda was a stay-at-home mom and Harry was a firefighter-turned-textile mill worker, Susan was much more of a daddy's girl. Her time with him was precious and made more so because she had so few years with him. In 1977, Linda would divorce Harry. He was utterly devastated and turned to alcohol to drown his pain. Harry fell into a deep depression, and just 1 month after the divorce, he would take his own life. Susan was only 6 years old. 1 year later, Linda would marry Beverly C. Russell, a local businessman. Beverly was also a prominent figure in the South Carolina Republican Party and the Christian Coalition. As Susan grew, her mental health worsened. Despite being an outwardly happy student who got good grades and did volunteer work, Susan would make an attempt on her life when she was just 13. A pattern of depression and poor decisions would establish itself in her life. At 16, Susan would make a shocking claim to a counselor at school. She was being molested by her stepfather, Beverly. The school would, of course, report the claims. A case would be opened and Susan's claim would be confirmed. However, nothing would come of it. No charges, no trial. Beverly and Susan continued to have a relationship and live under the same roof. In her later teens, Susan would find herself in a relationship with a married man. This relationship would inevitably fail, and the man would break things off with Susan. This would lead to another downward turn in Susan's mental health, and at 18, she would make a second attempt on her life. Susan's relationships would continue their tumultuous pattern into her adulthood. She would meet David Smith and soon found herself pregnant. The pair married, and their first son, Michael, would be born not long after. Unfortunately for Susan, having a child did little to help her maintain her relationship with David. Even though the pair fought regularly and separated multiple times, they had another boy, Alexander, in 1993. One reason for Susan and David's arguments and subsequent separation was allegations of cheating. Both David and Susan would accuse each other. Sometimes those accusations were true. One of Susan's paramours was a man named Tom Finley. Tom, a graphic designer, was known as Union, South Carolina's most eligible bachelor. Despite being married, Susan greatly valued her relationship with Tom. She felt comfortable with him, safe. She believed Tom would offer her the stability she so desperately craved. However, this would not be the case. Tom really did like Susan, but her life wasn't what he wanted. He didn't want a ready-made family, and he did not want children. On October 25, 1994, Tom would deliver a handwritten letter to Susan outlining his feelings and officially breaking things off with her. Susan felt lost and alone. Her only path to a functional, stable life was cut off right before her eyes. So, she loaded her boys into her car and went for a drive. Hours later, a hysterical Susan would report a crime. While alone at an intersection, Susan was attacked and carjacked by a black man who ended up driving off with Michael and Alexander in the back seat. As any mother would be, Susan was beside herself with fear and worry for the safety of her children. Susan's claims sparked a frenzy. Police and public searched for the boys. Reports were shown on national news. Susan and David made multiple television appearances. For 9 long days, the Smiths begged for the safe return of their boys. However, Susan's story was suspicious. It was full of holes, and investigators noticed. Both Susan and David were given polygraph tests. Susan had multiple tests. All came back as inconclusive. Her concern for the boys in private also appeared to be less of a priority. Tom Finley seemed to be first and foremost in her mind. She kept asking friends if the man mentioned her or had plans to visit her. Detectives were interviewing Susan again on November 3rd, 1994, when all the media scrutiny and public pressure finally got to her. She told police she let her car roll into John D. Long Lake, with her boys strapped into the back seat. This prompted detectives to search the lake for a second time. They found Susan's Mazda 122 feet from shore, submerged just off a boat ramp. The bodies of 3-year-old Michael and 1-year-old Alexander were inside. Susan Smith was formally charged with first-degree murder the same day. From the very beginning, detectives were doubtful of Susan's story and believed that she was responsible for the disappearance of her sons. By the second day of their investigation, they suspected she knew their location and hoped they would be found alive. Investigators combed nearby ponds and lakes, including John D. Long Lake. They believed anything they needed to find would be within 30 feet of the shore. So when the searches didn't turn anything up, they stopped looking. During interviews, Susan also gave a conflicting statement about the location of the supposed carjacking. She told detectives that a red light forced her to stop at an empty intersection. However, it was determined that she would only have had a red light if there was another vehicle present on the intersecting road. After a quick investigation and only a few months' wait, the trial began on July 18, 1995, with David Bruck and Judy Clark as co-counsel for the defense and Tommy Pope serving as chief prosecutor. In opening statements, Clark would tell the jury that Susan was a deeply troubled woman who suffered extreme depression. "This is not a case about evil. This is a case about despair and sadness." They would further argue that Susan drove to the edge of the lake with every intention of killing herself along with her sons. Yet, somehow, her body willed itself out of the car. Pope, on the other hand, described Susan's story as a complete fabrication, concocted to hide the fact that she murdered her children simply because they stood between her and her affair. Though it was thought that Susan did this just to be with Tom Finley, Susan would say she had no motive and was not in her right mind at the time of the murders. The prosecution would call Steve Merrow to the stand. Steve was a diver for the South Carolina Wildlife Department who helped comb John D. Long Lake. He described searching the murky water and shining his flashlight on the submerged vehicle. He told the court he saw a small hand pressed against the glass, and that the boys' heads were hanging down because of how the car had nosedived into the mud. Tom Finley would also take the stand. He would tell the court the nature of his relationship with Susan and the events leading up to October 25th, 1994. He would say he had seen her 3 times that day, and she seemed overwrought. While under cross-examination, Tom would say what a loving and caring woman Susan was. She was everyone's friend. He even claimed that after he caught her kissing another man at a hot tub party on October 15th, they remained on good terms. Pope presented the letter Tom wrote to Susan to the court, which had been recovered from the car. He read an excerpt from the 2-page letter. "There are some things about you which aren't suited for me. And yes, I'm speaking about your children. I'm sure your kids are good kids, but it really wouldn't matter how good they may be. The fact is, I just don't want children." The defense would use Susan's poor mental state and dysfunctional background as their key argument. They would call Jenny Ward as a witness, the caseworker who dealt with the 1989 allegations against Susan's stepfather, Beverly. Susan was 15 when Beverly kissed and fondled her, and he admitted his actions at the time. Susan, however, refused to press charges, and the matter was eventually sealed. Ward told the court she believed this was due to Beverly's connection with the local Republican Party. She also claimed the unaddressed abuse had a lingering effect later in life. When Pope cross-examined Ward, he pointed out Susan's continuing relationship with the man and how their sexual encounters continued until just 6 months before the murders. Ward was then forced to admit that Susan never seemed troubled by the events, nor was she suicidal. Clark would say Pope's argument was absurd. She would tell the court that Susan loved her boys unconditionally. What happened was a decision made with a confused mind and a broken heart. She would ask for a verdict of involuntary manslaughter. On July 22nd, the jury deliberated for 2.5 hours. They would return with a guilty verdict for murder. In the penalty phase of the trial, Beverly Russell would take the stand. He apologized for his behavior toward Susan and begged the jury to spare her life. The jury ultimately decided Susan's past had influenced her choices, and they would not seek the death penalty. The judge would give Susan life in prison with the possibility of parole in 2024. Susan Smith was incarcerated in administrative segregation at Camille Griffin Graham Correctional Institution. It was here that, in 2000, 2 correctional officers, Lieutenant Houston Cagle and Captain Alfred Rowe, were charged and fired for having sex with Susan. She would subsequently be transferred to Lee Correctional Institution. Susan will be eligible for parole sometime in November 2024. However, a recent infraction may hurt her chances. On August 26th, she was given an internal disciplinary charge after speaking on the phone with a documentary filmmaker. During the call, she allegedly agreed to give the filmmaker contact information for friends and family, including her ex-husband David Smith, who has since remarried and had 2 more children. It was also found that the filmmaker deposited money into Susan's commissary account. Inmates are prohibited from having phone or in-person interviews, but are permitted to write letters. She was charged with the violation on October 3rd. Beginning on October 4th, Susan lost telephone, tablet, and canteen privileges for 90 days. Was Susan merely a product of her upsetting past and poor mental health? Or did she kill her children out of selfishness because they didn't fit into her imaginary perfect life with her affair partner? As always, we here at Villains with Vaughn wish to thank you for your patience and for your continued support. Please leave a like, subscribe, and ring that bell, and let us know down in the comments below your thoughts on the case, as well as any suggestions for future cases. That means you, out there with a custom submission, can get your case featured here, maybe in a short or maybe in a full-blown video. Stay safe out there.